You've heard of hot takes and you're probably familiar with cold takes, but what do you know of lukewarm takes? They might be the truest takes of all, and we're serving up a preseason helping of lukewarm takes today on this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. So ESPN has released its preseason football power index. And in the second half of the pod today, we'll discuss some peculiarities we noticed from the worldwide leaders' analytical FPI formula and what they're predicting about the college football playoff. But first, we got some takes out of the oven. We've put them on the counter to cool, and they've hit a nice lukewarm temperature. John, you've been a columnist for approximately 84 years. Has an editor ever come to you and said, John, we'd like a helping of your most lukewarm takes?
No, they haven't. In fact, editors rarely talk to me unless I've done something wrong.
That's probably the way your readers are too, right? Nobody ever
Yes.
emails you and say, hey, nice column. They say, hey, idiot,
Yeah.
why'd you write this?
What's wrong with you?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're venturing into some uncharted terrain. Not many go into these lukewarm waters, but you can find hot takes out there everywhere. So we figured we'd serve up our lukewarm opinions about the season, and hope we maybe we can get some right in our mix. So, John, why don't you lead us off here? You got your first lukewarm take, your first lukewarm prediction about this SEC football season.
Okay, this listeners might find this stunning, but here's a lukewarm take for you. Vanderbilt will win an SEC game.
Whoa.
I know that defies all logic because we followed the course of Vanderbilt football of late, and it's not an upward trajectory. But I just think it will happen. And can I base that up with facts or even I don't know, an argument based in facts? No, I can't. It's just a gut feeling that miracles do happen, and somehow, somewhere, I can't pinpoint when, but Vanderbilt will find a victory in the conference.
That's interesting because that is bordering on hot take, John, particularly for you, who has been mocking Vanderbilt really throughout the entirety of your career, and for good reason. They help you along in that cause. But for you to say Vanderbilt will win an SEC game, not just a game. I mean, I could see you going out there on a limb and saying Vanderbilt will beat Alcorn State. Not Georgia State. I know how much you respect Georgia State, but maybe Alcorn State or Ball State. I could see you going there. But to say Vanderbilt will beat an SEC opponent after going winless in the conference last year and 2-10 overall, this is pretty bold for you. Do you have a game that you're eyeing? I'll run through the conference opponents here and see if one jumps out to you. They're at Missouri. They host Alabama. Maybe that's your one. Upset Kalen DeBoer in Alabama. At Kentucky, host Texas. At Auburn, they host South Carolina. They're at LSU, and I believe they host Tennessee. So does one jump out there? That wasn't part of the requirement for these takes, but I'm wondering if you'd go one step further and say this is the game you think they got a shot at.
South Carolina jumps out at me. I as much respect as I have for Shane Beamer and his permanent smirk on the sidelines, I think there's an opportunity from the Commodores. And I think you said that game will be in Nashville, right?
That is true. And when we think about some of the most daunting environments in college football to
Yes.
step into, I think of Vanderbilt Stadium there in Nashville, which has some corporate name on it now. I forget what it is.
Well, we don't need to say that. It's not our job to promote corporations. I think part of that factors in the home field advantage for the Commodores now is that the stadium has been under construction for quite a while, and I think opposing players kind of have to play through the fear that part of that construction might fall on their head at any time, and that those cranes could just topple over right into the middle of the field and create all kinds of damage.
Yes, roadblocks on the field and in your surroundings when you play Vanderbilt. Okay, so that certainly qualifies as a lukewarm take. On the hotter end of the spectrum, I would say that Vanderbilt will snap its conference losing streak at some point this season. So you went positive, I guess, for the Doors. I'm gonna rain on a team's parade here for my start. Seems like every preseason ranking I see has Missouri lurking at the bottom of the top 10. They're projected by many to be a playoff team. I think they are firmly in the playoff hunt. In fact, I've consulted my own analytical computer rankings, and I give Missouri a 34.3% chance of making the playoff. However, that's almost a 70% chance in my analytics that they won't make the playoff. So my lukewarm take, which I think does go a little bit against the grain, is that Missouri will not make the college football playoff despite having really what's a tailor-made schedule for playoff contention. One of the most accommodating schedules in the SEC. I think Missouri's going to be good. I got them penciled in at about 9-3, but they had some breaks in close games go their way last year. Harrison Mevis drilled a field goal of over 60 yards at the buzzer to beat Kansas State. They had all they could handle from Florida and were really fortunate to escape that game with a victory. So, the close games fell their way last year as they got to 11 wins. I think maybe a couple of those close games may reverse this year. So I don't think they quite get into playoff qualification. And as I said, I do feel like from the narrative that's out there that goes against the public opinion just a little bit.
I think that lukewarm take of yours has to do with the fact you covered Missouri for a while.
I did.
And I think while you were covering Missouri, those weren't remembered as the glory days. And you probably, the idea that formed for you was that you couldn't even comprehend of Missouri making a playoff in any shape or form, no matter what the format would be. If they said, we're going to put 40 teams in the college football playoff, you would have said, well, that's still not enough to accommodate Missouri. So I think this is probably goes back to your days of covering Missouri, and you can't fathom that program making a playoff.
Well, I'd push back a little bit, John, because I arrived in Columbia at the end of the 2013 season, which was one of the best years in Missouri football history. They won the East that year. They went 12-2, lost in the SEC championship. Now, I was coming in right at the end of that season, but the following year, I was on the beat and they went 11-3 and won the East again. Now, that team wasn't nearly as good as the one the year before, despite repeating in the East. But yeah, I was there for the entirety of that 2014 season. But maybe you're thinking I have more 2015 seasons and 2016 seasons in mind. Those were not memorable years for the Tigers. In fact, the most memorable thing from those seasons were the 2015 hunger strike and threatened to boycott a football game from Missouri that a lot of fans probably just want to completely forget that ever happened.
It's a wonder Missouri didn't get kicked out of the SEC at that very moment.
Threatening to not play a football game?
Yes, that you just can't allow that in the SEC. I apologize for that. And I think that goes back to some deep-seated prejudices on my part that I forget what Missouri's been able to accomplish, particularly in its early days in the SEC. It's as though I don't remember that. I've blocked it out because I thought it was so inconceivable that it would fare well in this conference. But it played in SEC championship games. It had some good seasons. And I apologize for not giving the Tigers credit. As you know, I'm much more optimistic about their chances. And I probably give them a better shot in making the playoffs this year than you do. I just love that schedule.
Oh, I do too. Yeah. So accommodating on the schedule. They have to go at Alabama, play at Alabama, but there are other tough games against Oklahoma, at Texas A&M. If they could split those two, even with a loss to Alabama, there is a path there to 10-2 without having to take your mind to some bizarre places. So certainly, I think they're a contender. I have their playoff percentage at 34.3%. John, what does your computer analytical formula calculate for Missouri as percentage chance to make the playoffs?
I don't have a computer.
Well, neither do
Sorry
I.
about
You're
that.
taking that too literally. What percentage chance would you give Missouri to make the playoff?
I would give them a 50-50 shot.
Okay, coin flip. All right, let's head to your next lukewarm take. Where are you going next after you leave Nashville and Vanderbilt at
Well,
1-7 in the SEC?
well, I just realized that my notebook with all my lukewarm takes
Mm-hmm.
just got tossed in the garbage last night, and I started a new notebook.
Oh,
So, but never fear, I'm going on the. I can be spontaneous when necessary. I can lose the game plan and just call plays at the line of scrimmage and say, "Let's go." You go deep. You
hot
do,
route. Okay.
yeah. You do hot route. You do a curl. You do a dig route. And next thing you know, everybody's open, and I'm completing another pass. So here's one I just thought of. Uh, Alabama fans will be more optimistic about their football program at the end of this season than they were at the end of Nick Saban's last season.
Okay. All right. So you're going back to the loss after the Rose Bowl and the dejection after that game, and you're thinking the optimism after this year will be greater than the morning after the Rose Bowl loss to Michigan. Is that the way
Yeah,
you're looking at it? Yeah.
yeah. And here's I'm thinking. For one thing, fans or Alabama fans were traumatized by Nick Saban retiring, just as they were traumatized when Bear Bryant retired. Two coaches who won um, 6 national championships apiece there, created dynasties and are recognized as the greatest coaches of all times. So I think it's important for the fan psyche to find reasons for optimism. And I think they will be looking very hard for those no matter how this season plays out. Now, I think Kalen DeBoer is a good coach, and I think he will do well. But here's something the Alabama fans might seize upon. Uh, Alabama's offense struggled at times last season. Jalen Milroe started, stopped, and lost his starting job for a game, came back, played better. But it wasn't the high-flying offense that we've seen in some of Saban's other recent teams. And Kalen DeBoer is known for offense. Nick Saban, as offensive-minded as he could be in the later years, was still a defensive guy. I think fans will say, well, Kalen DeBoer is a great offensive coach. He will be able to recruit to that offense, and college football is now in an offensive era. So Tide football will thrive more than ever.
John, the word guru gets thrown around a lot in college football. You can't just be a sharp-minded coach, a bright thinker, anything like that. If you are good on one side of the ball or with a particular position, the media, sports writers, columnists like us, broadcasters, they love to label you a guru. Will Kalen DeBoer be labeled by Alabama faithful as an offensive guru this season?
I think they will say that because they're afraid not to say that. And let's keep in mind, Alabama doesn't have the talent, offensive talent, that DeBoer had at Washington. Give him another
I think that's
season
fair.
to acquire that. And I think he will do fine with Jalen Milroe. He doesn't really fit his prototypical quarterback, but I think he's a good coach, and he will find ways to enhance what Jalen Milroe does. So, yes, I think Alabama fans are going to really look hard to see a half full glass this season.
Maybe at least half a guru. Then does that
A
count?
potential guru, a guru,
Potential guru.
a future guru. Yes.
All right. Well, you did pretty good on the fly with that lukewarm prediction. I have mine written down, so I'll consult my notes and serve one up for you here. Now, last week on the pod, we were laying out maybe the bleak path for Billy Napier to retain his job into a year 4 So this might be seen as a total 180 here, because I'm going to say that come October, I'm not saying Halloween, but at some point in October, Florida will be ranked in the top 25.
Oh,
I heard
wow,
that groan, John.
wow, that could rally the Gator faithful if they hear that. Imagine how things have changed where Florida fans could be ecstatic about making the top 25 and not the top 5. Boy.
Well, let me unpack this for you a little bit, because
Okay,
I think
go ahead. I mean, try to convince me, but
well, I think frustrations could really mount by the end of the season, by mid-November, even in Gainesville. But I just think the schedule sets up to where Florida could start pretty hot, and hope could be building inside the swamp. Florida fans could be thinking, hey, maybe in year 3, Billy Napier's got this figured out, and then it all comes crashing down late in the year. But early in the season, here's how it starts. Florida hosts Miami. I see that as a toss-up game. It's at the Swamp. Florida fans will be all in week 1 for that one. I think that could be tough on Miami. Week 2, Samford, so there shouldn't be much trouble there. Week 3, at home against Texas A&M. I mean, that feels like a little bit of a toss-up too, particularly since it's in the Swamp. And then week 4 is at Mississippi State, which I think is going to be in year 1 under Jeff Lebby. I think they're going to have their hands full and be one of the weaker teams in the conference. So I see a couple of 50-50 games there against Miami and Texas A&M, but they are at home. And then I see 2 other pretty winnable games. I mean, I see a path to 4-0 in the month of September for Florida. Now, 4-0 could turn into about 5-7 by season's end, and it could still end with Billy Napier's firing. But I think that schedule is set up for optimism to build at Florida, even if the end result is a coach firing and Florida's not even going to a bowl game.
Yeah, I think the second half of Florida's football season is just was built. Hey, let's get our coach fired. That's what was in mind when those games were scheduled. I see no hope there. But the first half, I see there's opportunity for success there. There's not opportunity for success in the second half of the season. However, I don't think Florida's going to beat Miami in the very first game.
Well, don't discredit the possibility that Miami has the game in hand. All they need to do is take a knee and run out the clock, and they still hand Florida the victory. I mean, we've seen it before. Mario Cristobal does remain the coach. Coral Gables.
I haven't forgotten that. I think if that happens again, Mario Cristobal runs the risk of having an NCAA investigation into whether he's betting on games and against his team. So I think he will be very cautious if he has a lead there in the Swamp and in the final minutes. I don't expect to see anything as exotic as a handoff. I think we're going to see an old Tim Tebow like play in the Swamp where quarterback just drives forward.
All right, your last lukewarm take, John. I've recovered your notes from the trash, and I believe there was something about Quinn Ewers and Nico Iamaleava. Wasn't that your last lukewarm take that you were thinking about today?
Did you just find one of my takes?
I only found one. You had them on separate pieces of paper, I believe. Very wasteful of you. I could only locate one from the rubbish bin here.
Well, that's okay because I've audibled and I've gotten I've come up with a different one that
I just teased your take on Nico and Quinn Ewers. You're leaving the listener hanging here.
I'm sorry. What was my take?
That Nico was going to get more Heisman buzz than Quinn Ewers would.
Yeah. Oh,
maybe you don't believe that anymore.
Now. No, I really think he will. I think he's a star waiting to happen, and I don't think college football realizes just how good he will be. We've only got one start from Nico, and that was in the in the Citrus Bowl against a 35-0 victory over Iowa. Keep in mind, Iowa's defense is not an embarrassment. Its offense is. So
quite a backhanded compliment there, John, to say,
well,
you know
no,
what,
but I
you
mean
are
it's
not
defense.
an embarrassment.
Yeah, way to go, guys. Keep it up.
Yeah.
Continue to avoid those red-faced, humiliating, emotional outbursts. No, so I give him a lot of credit that he's just an unusual-looking quarterback. When we see somebody that does things we're just not quite accepting of, we just don't expect to see it. Go back. I mentioned Tim Tebow earlier. We weren't used to seeing a quarterback run over linebackers, just seek them out and run over them. He was just, there was no quarterback really like Tim Tebow. And Nico will not follow in Tim Tebow's footsteps. He's too skinny for that. But he's 6'6", yet he's extremely elusive. He has that quickness about him, ability to change directions very quickly. I think he will be very hard to tackle in the open field. And you just don't see this kind of agility usually from a guy that's 6'6". He's also got a big arm. It's not Joe Milton big, but it's also not Joe Milton inaccurate either. So I just think this guy, and I think a game, once people get a glimpse of Nico, maybe they see his stats in that opener against Chattanooga, that a really sneaky good game in college football will be the next week against Tennessee and NC State, because you'll have Nico and you'll have Grayson McCall, the transfer from Coastal Carolina, now at North Carolina State, and going up against an SEC defense. I think there's curiosity about just how good he is. He was great in the Sun Belt, a 3-time player of the year in that league, but how he will do in an SEC game. So as for Quinn Ewers, this is really an unfair assessment of him. He's had a great career, but I've been accused of being too negative. And here's when I see a snapshot of Quinn Ewers, I don't see him. I see a Texas receiver in the Washington end zone trying to catch a ball that's uncatchable.
Yeah, I think you've been way too hard on Ewers for all that, John. I mean, it was an end-of-game sequence where Washington knew they weren't going to run. They knew he had to throw it into the end zone. And, I mean, as much as you see those end-of-game sequences against Washington, I see some touchdown passes against Alabama in Bryant-Denny Stadium, in which Texas pulled off one of the more monumental victories of the season, in part because of Quinn Ewers' performance.
Yeah, I preface that by saying it's not fair, and it probably speaks to my own shortcomings and not Quinn Ewers, but I can see not one but not two passes, and he wasn't throwing from midfield. This wasn't a Hail Mary. It's perched down on the Washington goal line. My gosh, you got these great receivers. Just give them a chance to make a one-on-one play on the ball, and he didn't. I think Carson Beck of Georgia makes that throw, since we're talking Heisman. And you know what? Maybe Nico will make that throw against Chattanooga in the season opener. Not as much on the line.
Yeah, I wonder if Nico will throw for 349 yards and 3 touchdowns in a win against Alabama. That's what Quinn Ewers did.
If he does, construction will begin on a Nico Yamaleava statue outside Neyland Stadium, and a street will be named after him just as the final whistle blows.
Yeah, I was playing devil's advocate a little bit there, but I actually kind of tend to agree with the take. I think Nico is going to generate a lot of Heisman buzz this year, and perhaps to your point, more so than Quinn Ewers, although I think Texas's overall team will be better than Tennessee's. But you mentioned Nico's ability to be elusive and make some plays with his legs. Even though he's certainly a pass-first quarterback, he can move some. And I think Heisman voters, they love those Heisman moments where a quarterback takes off and runs. I led you down this path, though, between Nico and Quinn Ewers. I believe you had one more impromptu lukewarm take you wanted to get off your chest. Is that right?
Well, it's your turn. You go ahead and give your lukewarm take.
Okay. Well, I was going to close us out and let you clear your deck, but
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, this popped into my head. I'm very high on Ole Miss. I think
mm-hmm.
Ole Miss has a national championship contender, not just a playoff contender. I think it has bring back the memories of Johnny Vaught back in the late 50s and early 60s under Lane Kiffin, who's already won 11 last year, won 10 games the 2 seasons before that. He's really beefed up his team through the transfer portal. Portal King, we know all about the nickname he bestowed upon himself, but I think he's added even more defense this time. Here's my lukewarm take that Ole Miss will have a top 5 SEC defense.
That
Now,
is
and
interesting.
we think about Ole Miss as offense, and certainly we think about Lane Kiffin the same way. But he's done a lot of recruiting toward that defense, getting Chris Paul, a linebacker, really productive linebacker at Arkansas, and of course getting Walter Nolan at Texas A&M, who's considered one of the best interior defensive linemen in the country. And then he added Florida's best pass rusher, and I can't pronounce his last name, Princely Yaman.
That sounds good.
Does it really? I don't feel comfortable saying it. But anyway, he also has enough coming back. I think he has defensive depth this time. He's had some good players, but I don't think he had as much depth as the best teams have on defense. I think he might have that this go round.
And that would be a notable development in Lane's 4 seasons at Ole Miss. He's never had a team rank in the top 5 of the conference in scoring defense. To your point, they're always one of the better teams offensively. Their defenses, other than his first season, haven't been a disaster. Year 1 was a disaster on defense, pretty good offense. After that, he's had sort of middle of the pack defenses. And your point is, with all these transfers, they could be top 5 in the conference defensively. I think it's plausible. I agree with you. That qualifies as a lukewarm against the grain take. So, but I want to put a pin in Ole Miss because we're going to come back to them in the next segment, looking at this ESPN FPI. But I'm going to close out the lukewarm takes with this, John. I think 4 SEC coaches will be fired this year. Now, there's 2 more schools coming into the league, so I feel like my chances are a little bit better for more firings with 16 teams in the fold versus 14. And on the other hand, though, some coaches I feel like are pretty safe. We got some year 1 coaches in here. Kalen DeBoer at Alabama, Mike Elko at Texas A&M. If you're a year 1 coach, you're probably off the list of coach firings. And I think there's some other coaches that are in very safe positions. I mean, Mark Stoops might as well have a lifetime contract at Kentucky. Kirby Smart's not going anywhere at Georgia. So there are some removed out of the conversation. But you've got a minimum of 2, maybe 3 coaches who come into this season on the hot seat. Sam Pittman's on a hot seat. Billy Napier, I don't care what folks at Florida say or his boss says, he's on the hot seat. You're 11-14 after 2 seasons. You're coming into this one on the hot seat. So there's 2 on the hot seat. I think Clark Lee, on the heels of a 2-10 season in which he didn't win any conference games, he would be on the hot seat at any other job in the SEC. Even at Vanderbilt, though, we've seen them make coaching changes in women's basketball, men's basketball last couple of years. So I think Clark Lee, if he's not on the hot seat, well, let's wait and see if he goes 2-10 or 3-9 this year, and he might find himself fired then. So that's 3 guys that I would consider hot seat or hot seat adjacent coming into the season. So how do you get to 4? Well, there's always that firing out of left field. Maybe coach finds himself under NCAA investigation and school says, hey, this is a great opportunity to get rid of the coach without paying his buyout. Does that sound familiar? Or you just never know what a coach might do with his university paid for cell phone. So there are some wild cards you can't always predict. Or, maybe a coach that we wouldn't consider to be on the hot seat now, might run into a tough schedule and lose a game they shouldn't, and all of a sudden their fan base is in fire everybody mode come mid-October. So it might be a little bit of a stretch. The safer number would probably say 3 coaches fired, but hey, we got to at least crank these takes up to a lukewarm temperature. So I'm saying 4 SEC coaches will be fired this year.
That's a bold take, and you didn't even mention the possibility of off-the-field improprieties, other than the NCAA rules violations. Let's face it, Blake, all of these coaches, they kind of play fast and loose with the rules, and there aren't as many NCAA investigators as there used to be, and we do have the NIL, so maybe you don't need to do that as much. But I will also Clark Lee. Now, see that is really a lukewarm take, because you think Vanderbilt. Well, does it really matter who the coach at Vanderbilt is unless it's James Franklin, who's worthy of some sort of a medal for what he accomplished at Vanderbilt in those 3 treasured seasons there? Clark Lee has not done well. I'll grant you that, but who does well there as a coach? One thing, though, I would like to see, if he does matriculate to the hot seat, I would prefer that you call it, rather than say Vanderbilt coach Clark Lee is on the hot seat, that you say Vanderbilt coach Clark Lee is dangling from the crane. See, something bad could happen there. It doesn't mean for certain it will, but dangling from the crane suggests you're in trouble.
I always think a coach is in trouble when you start seeing the word embattled in front of their name. It almost becomes part of their name. Like you can't read a preseason story probably at this point from a neutral media outlet, at least. I'm not talking about the Homer outlets. From a neutral media outlet, if you're reading a preseason story about Billy Napier or Sam Pittman, you're likely to see in front of them the words embattled coach. Like I said, it's like it's a prefix to their name. It's not Mr. Napier, it's embattled Coach Napier or embattled Coach Pittman. Do you think Clark Lee has progressed to the point where embattled coach belongs as part of his name, or is he not to the embattled coach stage yet? He's given up the guru label. He came to town with a defensive guru label attached. Yes, that has been left behind, but has he made the full transformation to guru to embattled coach?
Is the SEC where defensive gurus go to die?
Anymore, it is.
Jeremy Pruitt went to Tennessee as a defensive guru, and
became an embattled coach.
Yeah, you're right. What I like to see, notice how the team is beleaguered, and the coach is embattled. Embattled coach Clark Lee leads the beleaguered Commodores past the crane onto the field at the somewhat corporate name Vanderbilt Stadium. I think I'll write. It'd be okay to write that. I mean,
it sounds like a photo caption. Really, it sounds like a cut line. It's like you're working the desk. You pulled a page design shift and you just wrote a cut line for a photo as Clark Lee leads the Fighting Doors onto the field there in Nashville.
I think, I think it would make a great. It would make a great video. The line under the video, the caption for the video, because then you see him, and hopefully no one will trip in that scenario, but it would add a little something to it. So, gosh,
all right, John. Let's get to our ESPN FPI percentages here. We've spent enough time talking about Vanderbilt football for one podcast. We just ran over the buzzer amount there, so I hate to cut you off. But
okay.
All right, transitioning to ESPN's FPI. Out recently, John. It's always an interesting look, even if you don't agree with it. It takes sort of the emotion out of some of these rankings and puts a formula. We don't exactly know what all goes into that formula. Don't really care. More interested in the numbers. And the numbers I'm most interested in is not so much their top 25 rankings or how they rank the teams, but they assign a percentage to a team's chances to making the playoffs. And so there's really 9 teams from the SEC that have what I would call a reasonable chance to make the playoff. These are teams that FPI gives a better than 20% chance to make the playoff. So I'd say they can consider themselves playoff hopefuls. And they're the 9 teams we've been talking about on the pod for a while now. It's Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Missouri, Tennessee, Oklahoma, LSU, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M. Those are the 9 teams that ESPN thinks has the best chance of making the playoff from the SEC. And I think we would agree that some version of those 9 teams have the best shot. But what I'm interested in is the percentage assigned to these teams. At the high end, you have Georgia at 79.1%, which that feels even a little bit low. I mean, Georgia, I would think, has around a 90% chance, if not more, of making the playoff if I was doing the percentages. But what stands out to me even more is at the bottom. The team from the 9 that I listed as having the worst chance of making the playoff from the SEC, John, Ole Miss. ESPN's FPI gives Ole Miss just a 20.7%. We'll do some rounding, 21% chance of making the playoff. You're talking about Ole Miss as a potential national championship contender. I'm sort of believing in that, at least in terms of contender status. I think Ole Miss has a great shot of making the playoff. I would at least double, probably triple this 21% chance that ESPN is giving Ole Miss to make the playoff. It's not just the roster, it's the schedule. There's like 4 tough to tricky games on Ole Miss's schedule. They host LSU, or excuse me, they go to LSU, they host Oklahoma, they host Georgia, and then they go to the Swamp to play Florida. Who knows what state Florida will be in by the time that game is played in November. But those are really the 4 tricky games. Even if you split those 4, I think Ole Miss has a playoff resume. So what are we missing here? How does ESPN give Ole Miss just a 21% chance of making the playoff? Are we overrating Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin, or is something off with this ESPN computer formula?
Maybe whoever was doing the computer work put too much emphasis on that Georgia matchup last year when Georgia won 52-17. I just think this is a much better Ole Miss team, and it experienced a lot of positions. Jackson Dart, I'm thinking he'll continue to get better at quarterback. I don't really get that at all. That really sticks out to me. You mentioned the schedule. 3 toughest games, clearly LSU, Oklahoma, Georgia, and you're in Oxford for 2 of those games. At LSU. I know that's a terribly difficult place to win, but gosh, LSU's defense has got to come a long way still. So, and I look at the rest of those games, even a game like say Kentucky, that might be a better than average team perhaps. That's at home. South Carolina's a road game. Well, South Carolina, I don't mind playing South Carolina on the road. If I'm Ole Miss, I'd play those guys anywhere and feel good about it. Mississippi State, a rivalry game, but still a much better team, Ole Miss is. And at Florida, we will have an embattled coach and a beleaguered team homestanding for the Gators. So, okay, let's go the opposite way. What's wrong with Ole Miss? What do you see as a glaring problem for Ole Miss?
I don't think there is a glaring problem. I think, my hesitation would be, I guess, a couple things. One, I feel like they start the season with a loss. I'm not talking their season opener. I see the game against Georgia. Maybe it's just because of what happened against Georgia last year, but I still think there's a big enough gap there that I see them starting the year with a loss in some respects. So if I'm trying to make the argument that they don't make the playoff, it's that, well, unlike teams that don't have to face Georgia, Ole Miss has started the year with a loss. But still, they would have to lose 2 more, I think, to remove themselves from playoff consideration. And I just think they're going to get to about 10-2, maybe even 11-1. But I think 10-2 is probably the likeliest landing spot, and that would get them in the playoff almost certainly. But if I'm building the case against them, it would be the fact that they have Georgia on the schedule. Georgia absolutely drubbed them last year, and We think they're going to be better on defense. We know they've upgraded just in terms of personnel via the portal, but how will all those guys assemble? How will that product look? It's not a proven defense. We're buying in on the belief that these transfers are going to make the defense better. I think that's a reasonable belief to have. But if we're building the case against Ole Miss, I think it's that. It's that they have the Georgia game. So that's, a very likely loss, narrows your path to the playoff and a little bit of the mystery on defense. And I guess I would add in one more. As much as we think about Lane Kiffin as a quarterback guy, his offense is built around tempo and tempo run game. And the pass plays off the run. And they did lose Quinshon Judkins, their top running back, as a transfer to Ohio State. He was a really nice player. So that would sort of be my argument against Ole Miss, even though I think the Ole Miss is going to make the playoff.
Yeah, I also I think some people might look at Ole Miss and saying this transfer thing is a bit out of control. It's a bit much to sort of reassemble a team every season. But Lane Kiffin has kind of proved he can do that. So I don't think that's an issue. I wonder if, I guess, when you talk about, making a playoff, you got to have good quarterback play. And Jackson Dart, I don't know where you fall with Jackson Dart. I mean, do you think he's a top 5 quarterback in the SEC?
I don't know about top 5. Yeah, I don't know about top 5 because of how loaded the SEC is with quarterbacks this year. I think he's in the top half in the SEC, which maybe doesn't sound like much praise, but when I look at the quarterback talent in the league this year, even being top half, I think is pretty good. I'd say he's right on the borderline of top 5. That's probably a future podcast we need to do as we're waffling on it here, but he's probably in that 5 to 7 range, I would say, of SEC quarterbacks.
See, now that we start talking about it, I guess that's if I want to challenge my own take and say this is a national championship team, can win a national championship, is Jackson Dart good enough to do that? A quarterback? I'm not sure he is. I thought he improved significantly from his first season as a starter to his second at Ole Miss, but there's still room for more improvement. He's got a big arm, and I guess maybe it goes back to his first season. I've always got in the back of my mind, things are going well, that he might make a catastrophic mistake. And he didn't do that nearly as much last season as he did the year before. So maybe that's an outdated critique, but it's still there, So
I want to get on to some of these other playoff percentages, John, here as we wrap up. When I mentioned Georgia's at the high end at 79.1%. I would have them much higher than that to make the playoff. I would imagine you probably would too. Ole Miss is at the bottom of these 9 teams from the SEC at 20.7%. I'm going to read off the other 7 percentages, and you tell me one or two that feel out of whack to you. Either someone's got too high of a percentage to make the playoff or much too low. So here are the other 7 percentages of the SEC's playoff hopefuls. Texas, the ESPN FPI, I'm going to round these. Forget the decimals. Texas, the rounded percentage is 68% to make the playoff. Alabama, 57%. Missouri, 37%. Tennessee, 37% chance to make the playoff. Oklahoma, 37% chance to make the playoff. Same number for Missouri, Tennessee, and Oklahoma. Continuing on, LSU, 25% chance to make the playoff. And then Texas A&M joins Ole Miss with a 21% chance to make the playoff. So taking Ole Miss and Georgia out of the equation, from those other 7, what stands out to you as maybe the most peculiar figures you're seeing on those playoff chances?
I guess it would be Alabama and Oklahoma.
You think they're too high or too low?
They're both too high, I think. I don't think Alabama's not drastically higher. I would put its chances more like in the 45% range. Oklahoma to me would be lower. than that. We've got them at what, 37%? I would
Yeah,
probably.
and the reason that number stands out to me, I agree with you on Oklahoma in particular. Alabama, I don't have as much argument with. Maybe a smidge high. It feels like on Alabama, but Oklahoma feels awfully lofty at 37% because Oklahoma's schedule. Here's just half of it. 6 games seem pretty winnable, but the other 6 games: Texas, Tennessee, Ole Miss, Missouri, Alabama, LSU. I mean, you could be a pretty good team and lose to 4 of those 6 opponents. So when you're looking at toughest schedules in the SEC this year, I think Oklahoma might have the very toughest, which is why this 37% chance to make the playoff feels too high. And I'll add one more to the conversation. LSU, it's got a bit of a tough schedule too, not as tough as Oklahoma's. They have Southern Cal, Ole Miss, Alabama, and Oklahoma. But that 25% chance feels a little too low to me for LSU. I would have that certainly in the 30s, at least, above 30% chance. I still really like LSU's offense. I think it's going to be a bit of a struggle on defense. But just on offensive alone, I almost think they could split with those 4 opponents I mentioned, get to 10-2. I don't think they're a shoo-in for the playoff, but I would add them to the conversation. 25% chance of making the playoff for LSU feels a little bit too low.
I probably would go about 30. I look at LSU's schedule. It's not the easiest, but it's not the toughest. And I think the opener against Southern California, LSU will probably be favored. I think it's favored by about maybe 7 points, which seems about right. UCLA at home, you would expect it to win those games. But then you got Ole Miss, Alabama, and close out the season with Oklahoma. It doesn't play Georgia. It doesn't play Texas. So I think Alabama and Oklahoma, and of course Ole Miss would be its toughest games. But no, I agree with you. I think it could be I would probably give it a little bit better chance of making the playoffs. And I think what's interesting about all this, Blake, is that this conference has this many teams that you can actually talk about could make the playoff. I mean, what other league can go below the halfway mark and say, well, they got a shot?
Yeah, and it's not ludicrous to either. I mentioned these 9 teams having at least a 20% chance of making it. I think that's pretty reasonable for all 9 of these. Now, as you get to the bottom 7, those have pretty slim chances, I think, to make the playoff, and that's reflected in some of these analytical formulas. Well, we will leave it there. If you think this is not an embattled or beleaguered podcast, but is actually a quite good one, we would appreciate it if you could take a moment to give us a rate or review, or also subscribe to not miss an episode. We will be back with you very soon to discuss some more off-season musings as we lead up to the season opener in September. Thanks for listening to this installment of SEC Football Unfiltered.